Upstate International presents a panel discussion on the Iguana Tree by Michel Stone, moderated by Deryle Hope.
Greetings everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion of the book Iguana Tree by Michel Stone, a local author who lives in Spartanburg, South Carolina. My name is Deryle Hope, and I serve on the Upstate International Steering Committee. The book that we'll be discussing today has been selected as the community book read for Upstate International in 2015. Upstate International is a month-long program of internationally themed events that highlight, celebrate, and promote the rich international cultural diversity, heritage, and global connections of Upstate South Carolina. And the month of March has been designated as the month for celebration every year in Upstate South Carolina. So joining me on the panel today are three distinguished individuals who will be sharing with us their perspectives and insights about the book Iguana Tree. So let me start by introducing our panelists today. First, directly to my left is Dr. Rachel Moore, who is Associate Professor of History at Clemson University in South Carolina. Her research focuses on the history of communication in 19th century Mexico. And for the past 2 years, she's had students in her Introduction to Historical Research class investigate the impact of immigration on their hometowns. So welcome, Rachel. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And then next to Rachel, we have Miss Vera Gomez, who is a published poet who works as a business marketing professional. She is employed by Ernst & Young and assists in developing business communications and market enablement strategies for the company's climate change and sustainability services practice. Vera also serves as a workshop facilitator, performance poet, and a teaching poet through the Metropolitan Arts Council and Greenville County School District Smart Arts Program. So welcome Vera, being here today.
Thanks.
And then next to Vera is Dr. Bill Lasser, who is Alumni Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Clemson University and Director of the Calhoun Honors College. He is a graduate of Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is author of a number of books and articles on law and American politics. Dr. Lasser was also the professor of the author of the Iguana Tree, Michel Stone. So we have some interesting conversation about that, I'm sure, while she was a student at Clemson a number of years ago. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for being on the panel. And first, I want to throw out a question because I was moved by this book. I thought it had a great impact. Certainly, it made me think about things in a different way. And I'd just like to get a reading from each of you as to how this book impacted you. Did you find it inspiring and hopeful? Or what were your thoughts as you were reading this book? And Rachel, if we could start with you on that.
Sure. Well, as a historian, I guess I approached it maybe in a different way than just the casual reader. We were using this in a history class to start students thinking about the impact of immigration on their hometowns, and students felt very comfortable reading this because it was an environment a lot of them were familiar with, right? Rural areas in coastal South Carolina. It had an impact on me because I witnessed this book change the way that students think about immigration, think about immigrants, and think about the impact that it has on families.
That idea of change is very important because that's something we look at when we think about the book that we're going to choose for the read is a book that has an impact to change people and change thinking. And it certainly in reading this book, I felt that this book was that way. Vera, what about you? What were your initial impressions of this?
I think it's a wonderful love story and a tale about journey. For me personally, I'm Mexican-American. My parents are immigrants, and it was a nice reminder of how even today, as a grown woman, the struggle and the understanding of the illegal alien plight in America or the U.S. is still a hot topic. Right. It's still important. It has, social, political, and economic ramifications that, I hope eventually, as a country, we can help solve. And I think it's just a really great book. I mean, as a read for pleasure, it's a great story just about family, the importance of family. And then I found it very aspiring, just, Hector's commitment to his family and wanting to do better.
Right. Yeah, it's great to have that personal connection. I think that a lot of even Southern people reading this book, there's a connection with Southern people because of the fact that it is a Southern writer and it's placed in the South. It certainly gives a connection for that. And certainly, if you are from another country, you can connect to it in that way as well. And Bill, how about you? What did you see about this book?
I think the book does a wonderful job of humanizing the immigrant experience. I think so often, particularly when you come at it from the perspective that I do of reading the political arguments and debates and conversations about and legal debates about policy, we think in terms of big numbers and 11 million undocumented aliens, or a certain number of miles, 1,500 miles of border crossing. We think of these big numbers and big pictures, and we think of others. These aren't people like us. And so I think the book does a wonderful job for all of us, for students perhaps especially, but for all of us, in humanizing that experience and making people understand that these are people with the same concerns and the same issues, the same loves and fears and hopes that everyone else has, and I think that's a very important perspective.
Yeah, I think that's what to me was very inspiring about the book, is there's this sense of hope that you see from the very beginning and the end. In fact, she actually quotes at the very beginning of the book a quote from Aristotle about hope, and then the last few phrases of the book she talked. There's in the dialogue between some of the characters, there's a dialogue about hope, and the book seems to be infused with that. This sense of hope for something better, whatever that is in people's own estimations. The opening scene of the book is really one about separation. It's really when Hector leaves Lilia, his wife. They're separating, and they have a daughter, Alejandra. And so Hector's decided he's going to cross the border and come to a better life in the United States. And Lilia, the wife, Hector's wife, Lilia's grandmother, Crucita, and then Lilia's friend, Rosa, these two individuals, both seem to think that Hector is hard-headed, he's stubborn, he really shouldn't be crossing the border because he's denying his heritage by doing that, and that he's in some way bringing shame, or he's not honoring his heritage the way he should by his leaving his home and going abroad. What do you think about that sense of this sense of creating a new life and looking for a new life? Does that in any way indicate a shame in your own heritage? Vera, why don't we start with you on that?
I'd say absolutely not. I think, it ties into, I was just recently in Mexico, but, I think it's the economic decision as the provider of the family. What am I going to do? Am I going to work really hard and make 100 pesos? I think right now the exchange rate is 124 pesos per US dollar. So are you going to work really hard and do that, or try to find that opportunity to make more money? And you guys have probably seen this, but the immigrants that are in this country are very committed to family, and how they can save is amazing, so that they can send money back home. Because it's not only for advancement for themselves economically, but just the betterment of the quality of life for the family back in the country they're from. So I don't think he's negating his heritage and who and what he is. I think he's just a man who's dreaming of a better life for his wife and for his child.
Right. So it's really, there's a practical economic element to it. But what about this argument in the family that that some people by leaving are somehow being traitors? Is that a valid argument, or is that being presented in the book in a way that is valid in terms of what really happens in communities?
I was thinking about that, and I don't think that ambition is unpatriotic. And I think that if, say, someone like Crucita could see the life that Hector's living and the way that he's preserving a lot of Mexican traditions, or if she could see something like White Horse Road in Greenville, where there's so many Latino businesses, I think maybe that her perspective would be different, right? That there's as much a celebration of culture here as there is in Mexico in some ways.
Well, and that's what really International Month is all about. We're celebrating those cultures here. But is there this, there's probably this sense, I read in the book, there's this sense that in leaving your home country, you're risking a certain abandonment of heritage and culture. Is that, did you read that into it, or is there an element of that, Bill, in this?
Well, to me, I think as a factual matter, as my colleague just said, I don't think that's true. But at the same time, I think there's the people who emigrate are different than the people who stay behind. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, how has that shaped America as a culture, and what does it mean to be an immigrant culture? because there's a certain boldness, there's a certain commitment, there's a certain strength of character. All the positive qualities that Hector has make him go, and if he didn't have those qualities, and I think represented perhaps by some of the other characters, that they would stay behind. They can't see beyond the village. They can't imagine this better life. I think there's, from the European tradition, the views of America were so unrealistic, sometimes unrealistic on the positive side, streets paved with gold kind of thing.
Right.
But that inability to imagine. So I think it does illustrate that he's different. He has to be different to take this risk and to be this bold. And then that plays into the, you mentioned the starting businesses, and these are people who are at the core risk takers in a very positive way. They're willing to put their lives literally on the line for
that really casts a very positive light on immigrants and immigration. That the immigrants are those that are really the pariahs in their societies. They're the thinkers. They're the ones that are wanting to push ahead, and they may see their society as not being maybe where they want it to be or fast enough as they want it to move, and so then they take the move. So it really speaks in a way very positively to immigrants and to them as a group. Do you want to say something about that?
No, I was going to say it ties into what Bill was saying, just even that sense of entrepreneurship. I mean, and Rachel's, dead on it. You drive up White Horse Road, and I've lived in Greenville for a little over 20 years, and just how that area has developed. So that is, we're speaking about people, at heart, who are risk takers, who can take on or committed to taking on a challenge, and are just entrepreneurial in their spirit of whether it is to start a business or even just do that initial crossing.
Right.
Because as the book notes, it's not easy to do that crossing.
Very risky, risky. Yeah. And maybe we can talk about that in a minute. There's this sense of vulnerability that's in the book a lot. Vulnerability before the departure, vulnerability after you're here, because of things being really sort of out of your control in many cases. Certainly we see that in the middlemen traffickers, the coyotes who lead the people across the border and help them to get across. And there's a lot of tension in the novel as a result of that, certainly between Hector's crossing and then Lilia's crossing and then the daughter Alejandra, so we really don't know what happens in some cases with that. But in terms of these people who are helping those that are wanting to cross the border, who are they really? Are they criminals? Are these people who are wanting to help in some way? Are they perverted social workers? What category do you sort of do these people fall under? Because it seems like everyone in the book feels the need to use them in order to safely get across, because some seem to make the passage safer than others, and some say that if you don't use a coyote, then you won't make it across. You'll starve in the desert. So maybe Rachel, you can speak to that. What role do these people play, these coyotes, in society right now? Are they just are they criminals, or are they trying to help people, or are they taking advantage of a situation?
I think what we're seeing in the book is that coyotes are really opportunists, profiting as a result of so many people wanting to get across. And I think as time has moved on, that they've really become hooked into the drug cartels that are established in northern Mexico. So I think that if at one point they were perhaps independent entrepreneurs, I don't know that that's the case anymore. I think that they're part of a much larger network of illicit commerce that we see in that region.
So you think this has probably evolved over time? Maybe there was at one point where they were maybe trying to serve as agents in some way, but now they become connected in lots of other nefarious type of activities.
That's what I would say.
So, yeah, and the sense of I know when Hector's in the truck, and crossing the border, I'm claustrophobic. I don't like those short spaces, and to be in that space and sort of feel that tightness in that small space, hiding in a truck, and then not really knowing where the truck is going to get you across the border, or they're going to take you somewhere else, or there's this sense of vulnerability. Lily is the same way when she's crossing, And then with Alejandro, you know, the same kind of thing. There's this aura of just, you're in the hands of someone else. That someone else can take your life, they can take advantage of you, and that's the way it really is. I take it in terms of what happens in Mexico. Are there ways that immigrants can cross the border without using a coyote?
Well, to my mind, there's been a number of accounts recently in the media of especially the youth coming up from Central America on trains.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think that there's a wonderful documentary called Which Way Home about youth traveling up from Central America, and it points to how individuals traveling that way feel like they have more control over their fate, whereas with a coyote, you're completely at their mercy.
Right. So these are groups that are traveling, crossing the border, and they're traveling with the group identity, and maybe that makes them feel more
groups
secure
of 3 or 4.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that once they're on the other side of the border, there's this sense of vulnerability continues with the fact that they're undocumented. There are several scenes in the book where there are these encounters with law officers and how those encounters take place. And there's one encounter that takes place in Texas that's negative, and there's an encounter in South Carolina which is not quite as negative. It seems like there's a little bit more human side to it of the encounter in South Carolina. Bill, do you think that sense of fear, the sense of being illegal, is pervasive? Do you think that most undocumented workers feel that way, or is this? Do you think once they get here that doesn't become an issue anymore?
No. I think that fear is pervasive, and it's one of the key elements in any kind of immigration reform. I think it's the driving force behind the president's executive order, currently suspended by the courts, but to regularize the lives of people who are here, and to make it so that they can go through daily life and build careers and have family lives without fear. And I know lots of cases on this campus of people who are afraid to apply for financial aid because they don't want and I thought it was interesting. Certainly the United States government is not as always as efficient as we might like it, and in some ways giving information to the IRS doesn't mean it's going to get to the Immigration Service or to the IRS. I mean, but an undocumented person does not know that, and certainly has no confidence that filling out a federal form for financial aid, the fear is that form is going to somehow get to the police. Again, I don't think we have that kind of efficiency in our governmental structure. That's probably a good thing. But I think that fear is pervasive, and I think it's critical to deal with that so that people don't live their entire lives and then their children's lives often with the same fear.
There's this wonderful quote from the director of the IRS where he says, "I don't care where you're from or what you're doing. We just want your revenue."
That's right. Yeah.
Well, there is this perception that everything's connected, and one piece of information here transmits all through the system and gets over here. We know that it really doesn't quite work that way, but certainly that's the perception, I think, from people coming in that things are very well organized, and you let one piece of information be known here, and everyone's going to know about it, and that can end up causing you some difficulty in the future.
Well, so the census is a great example of that, where it's very difficult to count undocumented people because they're afraid to talk to a census worker. A census worker, some barely employed college kid with a summer job, who certainly doesn't go home and write letters to INS enforcement, but you can understand that fear. I mean, there's no question about it.
What is the dynamic of that within the community here, Vera? For example, you have on the one hand those who have come legally and gone through the system, those who have not come legally and sort of maybe are in this sense of fear, but yet it's the same community. They're all together, working together and doing things together and having socializing. How does that affect the community where you've got one segment of the population that's in this sort of sense of fear and foreboding?
I think a lot of it is just education, and I think within the community, I'm also part of a Spanish writing salon, and we have a mixture of people. I won't name any names, but some of us legally illegal immigrants. Some of us are born here, and then some really great writers who, work at, meatpacking plants and stuff. So, they may have work visas, but I think it's that vulnerability that causes, there's a sense of also invisibility and working toward being what's known as an invisible, and not wanting to approach, when you're really sick, actually going to a doctor because you're afraid you're going to get reported, and even crime. I mean, I just wish that undocumented workers would feel free to speak up, and even to a neighbor or to an employer, because last summer there was a rash of crime. A friend of mine's a freelance reporter, and he gave a talk to the salon not too long ago, but there was a rash of crime on payday where some kids were actually mugging undocumented workers and instilling the fear that you can't tell the police about it. But you can report a crime. A crime is a crime. It doesn't matter whether you're documented or not documented. Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know if you have anything to add, Rachel or Bill, but it's a complex situation.
And the skepticism of law enforcement is something that has a legacy from
years ago.
Right,
yeah,
years ago.
Right.
So
And
individuals living in Mexico probably harbored that anyway, and then to come to the United States and have it compounded by their being illegal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And now even I'm seeing more Greenville police officers who are bilingual. They're really doing community outreach. But I think that the vulnerability within the community, I think that when you see the community together, we have Cinco de Mayo coming up, right? So if you are brave enough to venture forth and experience the culture, you're going to see this beautifully engaged community of documented, undocumented, U.S.-born people celebrating their culture and heritage. But then also if you get to know people, and I think that's what Michel did really good with her book. She put a human face on people for us, but really getting to understand what their fears are, what their anxieties are. For Lilia, it was she just wanted to be with her husband. I mean, that's the takeaway I took. And so she was willing to take whatever risk she needed and allow herself to be vulnerable. And Hector, I don't really get the sense that Hector and Miguel and Pablo, the workers, were that invisible in this book, except for that scene with the officer down in was it Houston? No, yeah, it was
somewhere
Houston.
in Texas.
Somewhere in Texas, Brownsville. It was Brownsville. But that could, the attitude of that officer in the book could just be what is the norm in that part of the country.
Yeah,
well, it doesn't have to be the norm for it to be such a vivid example. Even, clearly that officer acted illegally. I mean, he fined them by basically stealing money from them. But if 100 officers follow the law and one does that, that's the story that's going to have an impact. And so, and it's very difficult to control that, especially given our federal system. There's such a divide between what's happening at the U.S. government level, at the local police state level. So it's a big problem.
I'm just going to add, and I know that you and I spoke about this before we sat down, but being able to visually see the reaction of this vulnerability. There's a great movie called A Better Life, which hits on so many of the things that the Iguana Tree hit on, but you're actually able to see through the actor's reaction toward police officers. His truck gets stolen, and him and his son, who's become very Americanized in this book, also shows that. I mentioned my parents were immigrants, so I saw a lot of my coming up in this movie. But I think it does a great example of putting the visual face, and that happens here too. And I love Miguel's entrepreneurship of even keeping, I'm going to give away something in the book, but that $100 that helped get them back to South Carolina, his ingenious to do that. And he's quite an interesting character.
I almost feel like the truck should be its own character in this book,
You're
because
right.
I feel like cars are so important to this idea of invisibility, right? We do all this reading about how immigrants need to attain social capital to establish themselves, and having a car is something that is tremendous.
It's huge,
because you're no longer at the mercy of public transit or a bicycle. You can get yourself someplace, but you also place yourself within the sights of law enforcement, right? So another book that I read about this, The Book of Unknown Americans, that was just published last year, talks about how immigrants from Panama living in this apartment complex, they always do the speed limit because they're petrified of being pulled over, right?
Yeah.
And losing that invisibility.
Well, it's this sense of victimization, and that you don't really have any rights, nor can you stand up for your rights. And that's what, when you start to read the book, that became to me very, very clear that, you know, even if you are in the right, if you fear that voicing that is going to jeopardize you from your illegal status, you won't stand up for your rights. And you're very easy then to be victimized that way. And that leads to corruption. That leads to corruption across the society because, for example, the police officer who was able to get away with that, when other people around him, his colleagues, could see he could get away with that, the light may go on and say, oh, well, I can do this too, you know. And so it seems to lead to corruption. So all these negative things lead to more negative things.
Well, I think it needs to be said, though, that, I mean, undocumented individuals aren't the only people at risk for that, as we've seen in Ferguson and elsewhere.
Right, absolutely.
This is, I think, a broader problem of powerlessness in our society. And, when you mentioned people driving the speed limit because they're afraid they'll get caught, that was exactly the description of African Americans in Ferguson driving home and so afraid that they'll get caught in this horrible system that was developed. So it's the combination of economic, class, I think, and made worse by immigration status.
I want to change the tone a little bit and just talk about this sense of responsibility and consequences, because I think that flows very strongly throughout the book, that we are responsible for our choices, and that with those choices they bring consequences, and some of those consequences are negative and some are positive. And when you look at the characters, you know, Hector and Lilia, they make some very clear choices, and those choices bring about some very clear consequences. My question to you is, do you think that the choices that both Hector and Lilia have made, that those choices were justified, given the consequences that they're faced with?
I mean, it's hard because of the baby. I think, and again, I think you mentioned, hopefully not giving away state secrets, that there'll be a sequel, and so perhaps we'll find out more what happens to Alejandra. But you know, that issue at the end is they kind of try to move forward with this horrific loss, but that risk just pervades this book. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think that's the one consequence that is so hard to cope with, I guess, would be.
It's not even the deportation of being sent back to Mexico. And I think, you know, I also think when we learn why the series of events that cause Lilia to follow her husband. I don't want to give away the book, right? But there's a reason why she, you know, I personally saw her as being very rash and impulsive when she did that. But we have to understand the situation she was in and what she was feeling to do that. But you know, I think you're right. The child, you know, what has become of the child is the most interesting consequence. But it's about choices, as you were mentioning, Deryle. But, you know, this is a book also about the choices that Lucas and Elizabeth have made. You know, why Lucas is in the situation he's in. And then they as a couple. And also, I think the book really brings to light so many different couple choices, you know, the couple that takes Miguel and Hector in, and the life that they're leading, the couple of you know, Lucas and Elizabeth, and you know, their struggle to farm the trees, right? And then also the other choice that, I think it's Jasper, who's Lucas and Elizabeth's friend, also a landowner, but the choices he's making. And, you know, I think the bottom line, it all comes down just to economics. Of why these people are making the choices they make.
Let me, and now that you bring up Lucas and Elizabeth, let me bring them up because I think that that's a very interesting dynamic. They actually take in Miguel in terms of employing him. And then the same thing happens with Miguel's friend, and there's the other person who takes him in as well and employs him. So you have these Americans, these sort of sympathetic American figures that are taking on these, and they obviously know that they're illegal immigrants, taking them on and giving them work to do. Do you think that Lucas and Elizabeth and people like them are really part of the problem, or are they part of the hope of this whole story and this whole saga?
I think it's a two-sided coin, right? Because they're genuinely sympathetic, compassionate people, but what's kind of implicit in their story is that there's a demand for their products, right? People want beautiful trees for their developments, for their homes, and that demand is causing them to turn to the labor that they can get, right? And I think if you were to ask the people living in the subdivisions who have these fully developed beautiful trees what they think of the immigrant situation, they perhaps wouldn't think fully through why they're able to live in a development with beautiful trees or how their lawns stayed mowed or things like that. So I think that they not only reveal something about themselves as characters, but about kind of the broader economics of this, right? That there needs to be a demand for this labor to be in place.
And the economics, I think, go ahead.
I'm trying to remember, correct me if I'm incorrect, but I think it was $7 an hour? Is that what they agreed on?
It might have been.
And, you know, really think about how many U.S. citizens would work for $7 an hour. And, you know, Rachel's comment, I was remembering, you know, in my 20s, you know, there were a lot of undocumented workers working at restaurants and stuff, and now the economics of how we've progressed as a society, you know, those workers are now in building and construction and landscaping, and so it is a supply and demand. So it is, I think it's a catch-22 and a double-sided coin. It just depends.
Well, it's been so interesting. The students that I have who live in places like Hilton Head or Augusta, when they talk to people about undocumented immigrants, the opinions there are much different than elsewhere. These are populations usually that will say, I have no problem with them because I'd like to go golfing on an impeccable golf course, and I understand what goes into that. And these are people of an economic class where they don't feel like they're in competition with someone who's earning $7 an hour for a job, right? Which is much different than you would see elsewhere. It's a very different perspective.
I had I'm sharing way too much personal stuff, but when I first moved here, I dated a Colombian American, and I went to dinner, and his father made the comment, you know, he said, "Oh, you're Mexican." I said, "Well, I'm Mexican American." And even within the cultures, right, it was, well, I was working to get some, Dad did landscaping, and he said, you know, the Mexicans just work for so much less. You know, I'm really trying to get people to pay me $15, and, you know, Jose took a job for me for $11.50. So even, you know, even within the culture, there's that dynamic of economics.
Those market forces there always, but is the fact that we have a situation in which people are willing to hire illegal immigrants and pay them less. If that were not the case, would that be better for the situation in terms of if people were not able to hire illegal immigrants, or they were required to pay a certain rate to everyone, would that correct some of the ills of the illegal immigration, or would that make it worse?
Well, we saw, I mean, we had an experiment when the economic collapse occurred. Undocumented, you know, illegal immigration dropped as well. Right. So clearly the driver of this is economic demand, without question. The problem is the same really as I think for any sort of in the past, whether it was American workers who were being exploited by employees to create by employers to create regulations, to create laws, policies, favorable to unionization or minimum wage laws or fair labor standards, but how you then apply them in a situation in which people are willing to work at under substandard conditions because they need or want this opportunity, and then other people who are willing to skirt the law. That enforcement issue becomes really the critical one.
Right.
So I think, yes, if you could create a system in which all workers on tree farms had protections across the board that American workers by law are supposed to have, you would change the economics somewhat, but you would still have a demand for it. But how you do that, I think, is the really difficult question. It's
always the difficulty of doing that. That's the problem here. Yeah. I want to bring up another issue, another character in the book who is always sort of the invisible character. She's there, but we don't hear much about her. But her presence is everywhere, and that is Alejandra, who is the daughter of Hector and Lilia. And she's really sort of an example of the impact of immigration on children, because she is a victim. I mean, she doesn't have a choice. The parents make the choice for her, and so we think she eventually crosses the border. We're not really sure what happens to her, but she is in contrast to the adults, because the adults make the choice to do something. They bear the responsibility. They have the consequences for it. In her case, the choice is made for her, and what consequences she will suffer, we don't really know, but we can imagine what those might be. So, speak a little bit about your impression of the figure that Alejandra represents in this novel. When we think about all the situation that's been happening with the in Central America and the flux of children that have been coming in, and I sort of see Alejandra in that crowd of children coming and the helplessness that she feels. How do you think that her presence in this novel sort of influences the action, the whole pathos of the novel?
Well, I mean, I'll start off. I think you mentioned the little comment or frontispiece, Aristotle's quote, "Hope is a waking dream," right. and I think of the American dream, and I think the American dream is about a better life for your kids. I mean, that's the cliche, right? There's some reality to that cliche. Sometimes that means crossing the border, having a child who then becomes an American citizen by virtue of being born here, and sometimes it has at least potentially tragic consequences, and we don't know if there's a sequel what happens, but of taking risks on behalf of your kids. And so I think to me, Alejandra represents that sense of future and hope and possibility, and all of us who come from immigrants at one time or another, have a great grandparent who, in my case, rolled cigars so that my grandfather could fix watches, my father could run a business, and I could be a professor. Is sort of the American dream. I mean, that's really what it's about. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the children are very important to that whole picture, and in this novel, she's clearly.
So you really see her as an element of the hope, the whole aspect of hope that will.
Well, the hope, but also the risk. I mean, I think it's both. In her case, a literal risk of who knows, she could be dead, she could be stolen, who knows, but also there are risks we don't know. It's not a guarantee. Right. So,
any other comments on that?
Well, I think that Alejandra's a little bit different than, say, the child immigrants we see coming from Central America, because Alejandra, we see her ripped from this loving family, right? Whereas the child immigrants that we see coming up from Central America are fleeing drug violence, and in this documentary, Which Way Home, they're fleeing broken families. That a number of parents said, well, I told him to go north because there's no room for him here. I've remarried. I don't necessarily want him in the family anymore. He's a drag around the house. They're coming from situations where they actually come to the United States hoping to be adopted. They have these dreams of establishing themselves here. Whereas Alejandra is nearly sort of orphaned, virtually orphaned by this experience. So I think that in her case, she's particularly.
It's doubly sad. Yeah, doubly sad to see that. Yeah. And we know that in speaking with the author that there is going to be now a sequel to the book that we're all curious to see how that's going to pan out. But it will certainly give us more insight as to what happens to Alejandra and how that develops. So I hope in the next book. This book, to me, seems to really put a human face on the whole topic of illegal immigration. And it's not just about statistics or money earned or legal and illegal situation, but it really does give you characters that you can identify with. Do you think that a book like this, like Iguana Tree, that it really has a role in this whole debate, this policy debate on immigration or on whatever topic it might be, but that books like this, fiction novels, that really put the human face on an issue that sometimes is so strident, that this really gives the human element to it that helps to have a policy debate and discussion that makes sense? Do you think that books like this do that kind of thing? You're probably the legal person, so maybe you can comment to that.
Well, I think the answer to the question is yes. I think it's an important part of the conversation, but I think it's a bit of a two-edged sword at the same time, because policymakers, I think, have to understand the human element, and I think relative to the issue we were just talking about, the president's executive order allows children who came to the United States illegally under the age of 16 and have lived in this country, I think, since 2010, they're covered in this sort of deportation waiver. And it's a very provisional process because Congress hasn't acted, but under the president's, at least, proposal to waive the deportation proceedings, in effect, de facto, for the moment, let them remain in this country without that fear. That's at least the hope. And so I think that's policy is based on an understanding of the humanity of children who had no choice and who end up here, and they're neither they're accepted here, nor do they belong in their country of origin. So that's real important. At the same time, I think there are economic realities, political realities. There's a lot of so policy has to sort of make hard choices, which people aren't going to like very much, and that's hard. I mean, it's very difficult. So I think the debate is often lacking this perspective, and so I think it's important to have it. But policy isn't, in a sense, this makes an easy case for. You could write a book about a harder case where it becomes more, the issue shifts.
So it provides a dimension, but it doesn't really solve the problem, and it can lead to another problem with perhaps maybe going overboard, maybe the other way in some things.
Well, I think every policy decision. I think of the healthcare debate, and one of the journalistic sort of sports is to come up with an example of someone who has benefited from Obamacare, and then come up with an example of a person who's not, been harmed by Obamacare. And at the end of the day, those are realities, but they don't, they can't drive the ultimate policy decision. That's one of the difficulties, I think, of crafting legislation and having it be both humane. But to me, I mean, I'll just say one more thing. It is so easy to think of the other and to think of people as not like yourself. And I think it's such it's a critical recipe in many bad policies and bad attitudes and horrific things that have happened in the world, to think of, well, those people are not like me. And I think this book is a really necessary corrective to say, no, these people are very much like me. Yeah. And I can see myself in that situation. Right. And maybe I can see my grandparents in that situation, or maybe I can see, and begin to humanize that.
Or even maybe I can't fathom the choices they had to make, and that makes me respect them for what they've done to come to this country, right?
Right. Well, you have to, when you think about even the situation of Alejandra, about the fact that a mother would be willing to do that because she wanted to be so much with her husband and the family, and she had the faith that this family would reconstitute itself in a better place. And so it's again this hope for a better future, this hope for something better, and people take risks based on that hope. We do that. The poet, how does the poet see the human face of this book and the importance of that?
I think it's a great book and a good read, and to dovetail onto what Bill was saying, you hit a really important point. We sometimes forget that we're all immigrants in this country. That's what makes the U.S. the great place that it is. And, you know, was it your great-grandfather that was a cigar roller?
Yeah.
You know, if he hadn't been ingenious enough and entrepreneurial enough to succeed at that, you know, would you be who you are today? And I think that you know, the characters in the Iguana Tree allow us to see that. And for me, it was the whole, you know, Miguel and Pablo and Hector working to assimilate into the situation they were in and to fit in and to make it work. I think it's really nice. You know, is it going to change policy, you know, at the federal level? I don't know. But I think that things start at the grassroots. Right. And the more, you know, as humans, we allow ourselves to stop and talk to some of those people at the Walmart, you know, in Berea, or really, you know, say hello to the person who's bussing our table at a restaurant, we're going to be able to humanize the story. I think, you know, you've asked us a lot about responsibility and choices, and I've been thinking about Alejandra the last couple of minutes, but you know, Lilia's ability or inability to, you know, as a mother, which I'm not, right? But to have someone take your child and not take your child, you know, that had to do with her own dreams of a better life and wanting her family to be whole. And then just, you know, the ramifications of that decision is interesting. So as a poet, I think, you know, I think it's a great story, and it helps, you know, us identify with different characters. Even there's a character in here named Maritza, who I found really interesting. You know, her role as the mother. You know, and for your audience, you know, she's the wife of Pablo, I think, and she has family here, and she does this great role of taking, you know, people in and being that central point. You know, she doesn't really say a lot in this book, but her presence is that, you know, in the Mexican culture, you know, the presence of la mujer. She's a stable rock. You know, she gets those guys up, she feeds them, and she does all that, and she says very little, very little. And I think one of the things for me, I had one of those moments when I read, and I'm trying to remember which character characterized Maritza as not being as beautiful as Lilia, which made me stop to think about, you know, what is beauty. Maritza is more indigenous than Lilia. You know, in my reading that, I was, and Rachel's looking at me like, yeah, you might know what I'm talking about, you know, because even that transcends into, you know, the Mexican culture. You know, for me, like particularly here when I moved to South Carolina, there was a very small population of Latinos that lived here. And I would go out to one of my favorite places, you know, Coronas, and the guys were like, "You're Mexican." And I'm like, "Yeah, you know, my parents are from Mexico." And they're like, "Oh, no, you're not, your nose." And true, I have a very European nose. So, you know, that concept of what is beauty and what is not. And I've gotten to know a lot of people from Guatemala at the parish, at the church I go to. And, you know, now that I've befriended them and know them better, the beauty that they have within their own culture, although it's still, you know, Mexican and Latino, it's just fabulous. So that was the one moment where I read, I have to remember this is the point of view of that female character saying, "Oh, but she's not as beautiful." And it's because she's probably 4'11" or 5 feet. And I don't know about you, Rachel, who's spent time in Mexico, but I immediately physically saw the type of woman that Maritza is, which is beautiful. And they have the most beautiful hair, too. I can envision that long hair that she rolled into a bun every morning before the household came up. So,
but that's a beautiful summary of this family connection, which I think is very strong in the book. There's always a desire to sort of have family, and things are in the context of family, or wanting to bring families together. And that's another aspect that I think of this novel that's interesting, and to me ties it a lot to being a Southern novel, is that there is this connection with place and with family, and those kinds of themes that tend to be Southern type themes in novels. So I think that's a beautiful aspect about this, that there's this sense of family on both sides of the border, whether it's the Latin family and their closeness, or even the American family and the way that they are. So I thought the book was good in explaining that and showing that. Is there anything specifically about the book that that struck you, that you would like to bring up or mention that maybe I haven't touched on, that you think was compelling in the book, or something that that inspired you in a special way?
Well, I wonder if these are uniquely Southern themes, but they're also very much immigrant themes, right? Because when you talked about the importance of place, the importance of family, my family is Italian American on one side and Puerto Rican American on the other side, both immigrant families, both living in New York City, and to them as well, though, family was so important, right? And place, whether it's your particular borough or, you're living outside Charleston. Right. So I wonder if it's just not sort of a universal immigrant story, that family in whatever shape or form becomes so important during this process.
I think it could very well be, and of course that's the American story, because America is a nation of immigrants, and so from wherever we come, we bring that with us, we bring that connection with us. So it is that. Well, this is the book, The Iguana Tree by Michel Stone. We certainly hope that you will take this book and read it and enjoy it. It certainly is very moving, and it is the community book read for the month of March that's been selected and by Upstate International. And so I want to thank our panelists for being here today and talking with us and giving us these insights. And appreciate your being here, and certainly hope that you will all take this book and check with the Upstate International website to see if you can find where there'll be other discussions, local discussions about this book in your local library. So hopefully you'll get a chance to read it and to discuss it further. So thank you for being with us today.